everyone, and welcome to our Bible Ponder. We're continuing our series looking at small and somewhat overlooked passages of the Bible that have a pretty outsized impact on both the history and culture of our Jewish and Christian worlds. These are texts that really establish a lot that would have been really important in terms of what they're conveying historically, but aren't verses we necessarily preach a lot or teach a lot or talk about a lot. And so last week we looked at the building of the tabernacle, but specifically the idea of constructing the Ark of the Covenant and putting the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies and it being a place where God could be found, where God would dwell, really shifting the Israelite people from a nomadic people following a God who is out there to a cultic people, a cultic religion with a specific kind of practice. It's a pretty massive shift historically for them to go from simply a people following an ancestral God to having a specific set of rules and regulations and a specific sort of place where God dwells there in the tabernacle, which eventually is transported to the permanent location of the temple. So this week, we're going to skip ahead quite a bit historically, and we're going to look at a story. Now, this is overall a story that I think we've maybe heard a bit before, but there's one specific detail I think is really important that I want to talk about. And this is the reign of the king Josiah. Now, Josiah sticks out in my mind a lot because when I was a kid, we did a play with the kids in school that was about King Josiah. And so Josiah has always been sort of prominent in my mind because of being part of that kids play in church growing up. But he's someone we've talked about a little bit. He was very, very young when he became king. And when I read the text, you'll see exactly what I mean. But he's famous because he is a reforming king. In 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, which report most of the same events, you have a lot of kings in the split kingdom of the south and the north, and a lot of kings that aren't particularly faithful to the law or ruling in such a way as they would have expected David or Solomon to rule. And so you have a lot of these kings. You also have a lot of invading armies. You have the rise of Assyria. You have Egypt. And you have a lot of different warring factions. And so it's a very tumultuous time. And for a really small nation sort of caught between, again, Egypt and Assyria and other bigger powers, there's a lot of conquering going on. So in the midst of this, Josiah comes along and says, we're being conquered because we're not following the law. So let me read this and we'll get into what I want to talk about specifically. So just to set the scene historically before we get in, Josiah likely reigned from about 640 BCE he reigned for 30 years, from about 640 BCE to about 610. So some, give or take a year in there, sometime around there. So the 600s BCE is when Josiah is reigning. We don't have specific archaeological evidence for him with his name or with his inscriptions or anything. There is a ring that survives that mentions a name of someone who's mentioned in the Bible as his assistant, and it has his name as an assistant of the king, which is fairly decent corroborative evidence. But the other evidence we have that's more circumstantial as a reformer is we have the evidence of certain stamps and things which bore images like stars and moons and things like that, which would have been more associated with the other gods that wouldn't have been Jewish, and a big shift to all of those being gone, none of those images being on the stamps and things like that, and it just having names and words and things, which would corroborate the evidence of a big reform towards monotheism and a kicking out of foreign gods. But there's not a lot of archaeological evidence for a lot of the kings of Israel and Judah, which in part because there's not much historical evidence, but also they're being attacked and conquered a lot, Egypt and Assyria, and there's a lot of fighting going on. And it's a pretty oral culture. There's not a whole lot of writing down of things. And so there isn't a whole lot of evidence, but there's some evidence for Josiah having actually existed and done some of what he did. But here's what's interesting. So let's get into the text. This is from 2 Kings chapter 22. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Ediah. She was from Bozkath. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. In the 18th year of his reign, King Josiah sent to the secretary Shaphan, son of Azaliah, to the son of Meshullam, to the temple of the Lord. He said, "Go up to Hilkiah the high priest and have him get ready the money that has been brought into the temple of the Lord, which the doorkeepers have collected from the people. Have them entrust it to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple, and have these men pay the workers who repair the temple of the Lord, the carpenters, the builders, and the masons. Also have them purchase timber and dressed stone to repair the temple. But they need not account for the money entrusted to them because they are honest in their dealings." So they've raised money to restore the temple. And this is pretty common in ancient times to restore the temple of your god. This happens in Assyrian culture, Babylonian culture, Egyptian culture. Famously, Tutankhamun in Egypt was known to have been a bit of a reformer like Josiah, a very similar sort of story of purging of this sort of newfangled fancies of people and a restoration of ancient gods and ancient religion. So they've raised money to restore the temple, and they're setting to work on it. Verse 8, Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord." He gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Then Shaphan the secretary went to the king and reported to him, "Your officials have paid out the money that was in the temple of the Lord, and have entrusted it to the workers and supervisors of the temple." Then Shaphan the secretary informed the king, "Hilkiah the priest has given me a book." And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. So this is also something that happened in other places historically. It was pretty common when you built the temple to have bricks or places that you would build into it and put documents in. And we sort of do this with sort of capstones or time capsules or things like that. But it is something they did. They would put documents for safekeeping or just to have them be found when some future king would restore the temple. And whether it was just something to do as just something to do, or whether it was specifically to try and preserve certain amounts of information. But it is what they have done here. And so when they're restoring the temple, they find this document. So it just says in the text, the book of the law. And scholars guess that this is probably Deuteronomy based, or at least parts of Deuteronomy based on what they find. But here's what's interesting. We don't specifically know. But what we're getting a glimpse at here is the collection and preservation of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament. So it isn't the case that the people living then would have just sort of built on it chronologically. So as so-and-so writes a book, now we have that one, and then so-and-so writes another book, and now we have that one. That's not how it worked, and it's not how it worked in the New Testament either. But what they have is they're collecting different fragments, and then at some point in history, they go, here's everything we have. Let's categorize it. Let's codify it, and let's call it done. This is now the Hebrew Bible. So what they have are fragments. I don't know what they had or were using before they uncover perhaps bits of Deuteronomy here buried in the temple, or what bits they find, but it shows that they were losing some bits and finding other bits, and it lends credence to the notion that as scholars are studying the text and actually looking at how the text is formed and looking at manuscripts and the ancient languages, that they weren't just written from start to finish, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, like that all in one thing. There were fragments of it. There were bits of it that were found and discovered and written and collected and stuck together over time. And so this is one of those scenes where we see when this is happening, and it would make sense for them to at a time of religious fervor, of returning to their old ways, to start collecting everything they have and find, this book here we found in the temple, we still have this one, and there's this scroll over here, and begin to collect it together and stitch it together into what we think of as the Hebrew Bible. So what we can see here from the reign of Josiah is one of those moments, and this isn't something to think of as weird or scary or wrong. This is the way it happened. This is the way the ancient world works. We don't freak out about the information we have about other ancient cultures. We accept it for what it is. We reconstruct things historically, and it's pretty much the same here with an ancient Israelite culture. And so here we have them collecting, discovering, and beginning to stitch together bits of the Hebrew Bible that they find, and then it affects how they do it. As it goes on, it says, "When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam the son of Shaphan, Akbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the king's attendant. Go and inquire of the Lord for me, and for the people and for all Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us." So everything Josiah does has to do with them rediscovering this bit of text in their restoration of the temple. So go and read it there. 2 Kings 22 and 23 has a lot about Josiah. Also, if you want to read the similar story but from a different perspective, it's also in 2 Chronicles 34. Kings and Chronicles really mirror each other in the text. They're just compiled from different sources, which is another one of those little quirks and arguments for the collection of the texts. The Chronicles are written from quite a different perspective than the books of Kings, although they relate mostly the same events. So very interesting, at least interesting to me. I hope you find that interesting as well. And I hope that you have a good evening, and I'll see you next week.